Okay, we will try again. So good afternoon. we need to resume for panel two. Before we start panel two, I just wanted to announce that that next year's theme will be emerging international best practices, and Prajapati Trivedi will be the chair of the program for next year. He is the former cabinet minister for performance in India, and is now graduated to run performance projects, for the Commonwealth, called the Commonwealth or the British Commonwealth. So the sun never sets on his performance efforts, right? So if you're interested in discussing that, share whether, and particularly in terms of suggesting any international perspectives from Canada. And then, like Lyle represents Canada here, and we'd be interested. So panel two is building government infrastructure to sustain change. Let me introduce the the participants on the panel who are with us so far. So looking, is Robert Wright here or Kevin Marino? Okay, they may come late, but we have a lot of performance power on the panel, and we'll take advantage of the time if it's extra time. So, from right to left, Eugene Monaco. Eugene Monaco is the executive director of the Professional Development Program and distinguished public service professor at University at Albany, and he's been waving the flag on performance for decades and decades, as long as I have. Next to him is Luke Fuller. Luke is a senior performance analyst with the San Francisco Controller's Office, where he uses coaching, facilitation, and business analysis to make data come to life, helping people see and understand the impact of their work, find opportunities, try new ideas, and communicate with the public about how the government is doing, which is a mouthful, but you're on the right track. And next to him is Jane Wiseman, is an Innovations in Government, an American Government Fellow at the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation, and leads the Institute for Excellence in Government, a nonprofit consulting firm dedicated to improving government performance. So we have three people who are deep into this, who can provide different perspectives. Each one will make a presentation of about 15 minutes. I will play timekeeper, but you want to listen to them more than you want to listen to me, read their bios again. So Gene, you're on.
Sure.
Okay.
Good afternoon. Hey, I have the privilege of being the first speaker after lunch. And you always know being the first speaker after lunch is a challenge. So I hope I'm up to the challenge this afternoon. This morning we talked a little bit about innovation. And Brian talked about making change and making change incrementally. And what I'm going to talk about this afternoon is how do you produce effective leaders at different management levels in state government. And let me start off by saying that the Professional Development Program at Rockefeller College of Public Policy has been around for some 45 years. And we have been working with government agencies, both at the state and local level, mainly in New York State, and not-for-profits. So we have a background in working with government. Our mission is very straightforward. We do education and training. We're a large education and training organization. And our vision is even more succinct. And that is, if we're doing our job in the education and training of public service workers, we're helping government work better. And we take that very seriously, and we have not deviated from that mission in 45 years. And that has been the cornerstone of our success. Now, in doing that, I'm not going to go through this, but we do a lot of training. And we have to, for the State University of New York, gather data. And this past year, we offered some 2,700 instructional activities, enrolling some 266,000 plus trainees. And those are real numbers. Now, as you can see, most of our training has gravitated away from instructor-led to technology-based, which is not unusual. And you folks who are out there as practitioners have been the beneficiaries of that. So that's a little background about who we are. We've been in the business, and we know how to do education and training. However, it's always a challenge, particularly if you're working with New York State. New York State is not unique, but it has a number of unique features. It's very big, it's very diversified. When I talk to folks, they think New York State is New York City. And it's a large, large state. And the New York State public workforce over the past decade has undergone tremendous change. And that has created a need for a different way of leading and managing as we move into the future. Let me just say that here are some of the things that have impacted New York State government. They're not unique. Diversity. I mean, we know about diversity, and New York is probably one of the most diverse states in the nation. However, if you look at some of the data from the Pew Research Center, in 1965, 80% of the workforce was white. In 2015, 62% is white. And projected ahead to 2065, only 46% of the workforce will be white. The rest will be Asian, Hispanic, and Black. Diversity is here to stay, whether it be racial diversity, cultural diversity, religious diversity. Diversity is something that every workforce is facing. And the New York State workforce is facing this tenfold. Now, added to that, and the presentations this morning really underscored it, technology has influenced the way we work, the way we talk, the way we act, what we do. And if you look back a decade ago or 2 decades ago, technology wasn't that important. But moving ahead, technology is going to really change how the workforce progresses. And what we have found, which is not shocking, is that you need to train and retrain workers at every single level, and specifically at the executive and leadership level. And what we've also found is that because of all this technology, there's been a lot of efficiencies in the workplace. But what we found in New York State is that there's been turnover in key leadership positions at a very, very fast pace. And in New York State, people are leaving state government a lot sooner. And this is really having an impact. Now, much of the data that I'm going to talk about comes from this New York State Workforce Management Report. This report is done every 2 years. The next report will be coming out in 2020. What we find, and I've just mentioned this, is that from 2008 to 2018, the New York State workforce decreased by 15%. Now, you think of your own workforce and you think of a 15% reduction. And that's going to have an impact. And what we've found is a couple of things, and I want to just talk about this a little bit. We found that the average age of workers in New York State is 47. New hires coming into the system is 36. MC means management confidentials. This is the professional. This is where a lot of the leaders are and where they reside is 50. The average age of retirement is 61. You don't have to do the math to see what's happening. Now, what the Pew Research Center also says is that people are staying in the workforce much longer. That's true, but not in New York State. They're leaving the workforce and they're going into second careers. And what we also find is that there's about 149,000 and change employees in New York State. Of that, 141,000 are in that retirement system. Projecting ahead, by 2022, over 27,000 employees are expected to retire. And if you look at 61 being the average age of retirement, you've got over 18,000 individuals, workers, that are leaving the system. So you are having a real leadership and management problem. How do you manage and lead in an environment that is changing so rapidly and that you're losing your key personnel? And this is just something I kind of like, where are the top 10 titles that are separating from the workforce? And it goes from the correction officers, which I would think would have been a lot greater than 8%, to highway workers, some of those folks that we talked about this morning. But what was really startling to me, and I like data and I like analyzing it, is that we're losing nurses at a rapid rate, those that are working in hospitals and those that are working in research centers and in some of the helping agencies in New York at an alarming rate. And many of these nurses are in supervisory positions. So I painted a picture here that how do you develop leaders moving forward? How do you manage and lead in an environment that is as volatile as the environment that I've just described? Well, one of the ways is to do education and training. That's the business that I'm in. And I talk about, and I like to talk about coalition building and the three-legged stool. Now, we all know about the three-legged stool. If one of those legs breaks, what happens to the stool? It collapses, right? If one of those legs is not as strong as the other two, it's wobbly, and you don't want to sit on it. So this leadership development training program is based upon a three-legged stool. Government, meaning the executive branch of New York State government, the governor's office, said we have to do something about succession planning and about how do we train and retrain leaders. The unions are all for that if it's going to help their employees advance. Now, government and the unions are not able to come up with a program on their own. And so they turned to the university at Albany, Rockefeller College, and specifically the professional development program, to help and develop a leadership training program that would be sustainable over time and that would work and that could be measured. And we're talking about data analytics, and I've got a few of those. So what we came up with, and this wasn't easy, working with the governor's office. How many folks are from New York here? A few, okay. Working with the current governor, he's very hands-on. And it's very difficult to get things approved without his blessing. So that is a challenge. Working with the unions is a challenge. Many of you folks probably work with unions or are union members. We came up with a 3-tier program. One for aspiring leaders at the entry level, new supervisors, new managers who really have had no training. The second program was for middle managers. And the third, and the most challenging, the one that I'm most familiar with and I teach in, is the executive leadership program for the senior managers in the state of New York. Now, this did not happen overnight. It took several years to iron out all of the specifics. And it was based upon, and this is where we come in, the academics, we need to have a foundation to base these programs on. And it was based upon the taxonomy of leadership behavior by Eugene. And there are 4 main components of that. It is, you need to teach things that are task-oriented. You need to teach things that are relations-oriented. You need to involve change-oriented topics, which we talked about this morning. And you need to have a networking, communication, and an external component. So each program has this as a foundation. Well, the executive level program went a step further and used the U.S. Office of Personnel Management Executive Core Qualifications as well. And that in those core qualifications, these are the core qualifications, and I won't go into any detail on that. I don't know how my time is there, Mark. You need to lead.
3 minutes.
Oh, my God. You need to lead people. Our other panelists haven't come yet, so you can give me a couple more. You give me a couple more minutes. You need to know how to lead people. You need to lead change. You need to build coalitions. You need to have business acumen, and that is, how do you work with people, human resources, work with technology, how do you communicate, and you need to get results. So, in the end, this is what the program looks like. All 3 programs have, we're going to have an introduction to leadership. We're going to talk about leadership strategies. We're going to give you some leadership tools that you can actually use and bring back to the workplace. And we're going to let you leave with expectations on how you're going to work as a leader. How are you going to lead change, as Brian was talking about this morning? How are you going to enhance excellence in your organization? And I don't have time to go into each one of these areas, but they are very challenging. So, how's it going? Well, here are some anecdotal comments that trainees have given us. I've improved my management, leadership, and decision-making skills. I can't wait to apply all that I've learned about management and leadership. I've learned techniques that will help me be more efficient and an effective leader. It goes back to the foundations that we built this program on. And these testimonials are proof that we're on the right track. So being in the academic arena, we need to measure our results. We need to look at, did we realize our program goals? Were we able to demonstrate professional growth? Has there been any increased improvements in leadership development that we can actually put our hands on? And is the design of this program valid going forward? Now, one of the things that we haven't launched yet, because the program's still relatively new, is a longitudinal study. And that longitudinal study needs to measure impact over time. And that's the next step. So looking at the aspiring leaders, this is just a snapshot of a program that happened in January. There is a waiting list for the aspiring leaders of like 500 aspiring leaders. 500. We cannot get these programs out fast enough to meet the demand. And this is a 3-day program. It's the most basic program. It's 21 hours. And then, and this is just another measurement of reaction means. Then we had the Middle Managers Program, which is the program that we were able to implement first. It's the one we were able to get sign-off on from both the governor's office and the union. And in 2018, the pre-mean, pre-test, and post-mean change was 36%. That was a considerable gain in knowledge. As a matter of fact, we're launching a new management program today, and one of the changes we made is that we bring the graduates back from previous programs and have them talk to the new class about the experience they had and what they learned and how they're applying some of the principles that they learned on the job and how they're progressing. And we find this to be very valuable. And this is just a summary of the program that we ran. Okay, we ran in 3 areas in New York State last year, in Rochester, in Albany, which is the state capital, of course, and in New York City. And as you can see, there is a significant amount of change that has taken place. Now, in the senior managers, we surveyed, a senior manager program is going on right now, and I just finished up 2 sessions last week on managing teams and working with teams. And we surveyed the current program, and what they said, the biggest issue they're dealing with is succession planning. And how do you hire and keep new trainees, or new employees in your system? And what we've seen is that the impact of this program has been very positive. This is on scale, obviously, of 1 to 5. So, in conclusion, right on time, Mark, what we found is that we think that the results of linking practice wisdom, the wisdom of the state and the unions, with the academic wisdom has produced an evidence-based program that is effective. Its evaluation, the evaluation data to date supports this model, and it's a key to future success. And as I mentioned earlier, we do need to do longer range studies. So, right on time. That's it. Thank you.
Hey everybody. My name is Luke Fuller. I've had the opportunity to meet a few of you, but for those of you who we haven't crossed paths yet, I'm an analyst with the Controller's Office in San Francisco. I'm going to tell you a bit there are two mics. I'm going to tell you a bit about some of the work that we did over the last year or two in one of our programs that focuses, to the point of this panel, at more of a system level. At the end, I'll kind of connect it back to some of the other more tangible interventions that we're doing. And then there's a follow-up presentation tomorrow with some of my colleagues that you all should go to hear about chapter 2 of that. So my team works with other departments in San Francisco to really just manage projects, measure performance, and help them with their work. We do a lot of coaching, we do a lot of analysis for them, but increasingly we're trying to give them the tools and the knowledge to do analysis themselves. One of our programs, the one I'll be talking about today, collects and reports performance metrics. Here we go. Collects and reports performance metrics from across the entire city. We put a lot of effort into this. Every 6 months, we put out 2 reports, really to make it available to city leaders and to the public. But it wasn't really clear what we were getting for all of this effort. So 2 years ago, we took a hard look at our program and started a process to rethink our work and kind of revamp a lot of the work that we were doing around it. So in the first year, we made some big improvements, but I think the more important part of this is that a lot of departments started coming to us directly to work with them on their own priorities after this. So we learned about what departments wanted from our process, and we learned really what we needed to do to support that work a little bit better. So the Controller's Office in San Francisco does a lot. I've mentioned this to a few of you who I've met already, but we've kind of accumulated a lot of responsibilities under this group. We're independent from the legislature and the mayor's office. We're kind of the deep state. We just focus on good government in a lot of cases. That's sort of like our function as an ombudsman. We don't call it that, but we're, like I said, kind of a consulting group for making sure that other governments are doing work well. We don't do audits, but we have a team that does that when things don't go well for us. We're also kind of a clearinghouse for performance data across the city. And in 2017, we were working with 50 departments to collect over 1,000 metrics that were reported every 6 months. This includes information about all of your normal core services, emergency response, public benefits, transit, things like that. And we would go through this effort every 6 months to come up with a report or come up with a huge appendix for the mayor's budget proposal. And it was kind of a good exercise for us. It was interesting to get all that information, but it wasn't really clear what we got for all that effort other than these reports. So we spent hundreds of hours, really, just our team, 300 to 400 hours every 6 months. Then there's all the department effort. You can imagine this magnifying out. Often the information was really only used sporadically. It might be mentioned by a committee, or it might be mentioned by another department head. On the rare occasion, it might be mentioned by a local journalist in one of their articles. It was like a big win for us at the time. That does happen more now. I promise it gets better. But really, the metrics also just reflected older priorities. A lot of those metrics that we were collecting were decided maybe a decade ago. Different leadership, different things going on, different state of the city. So last year, we started a process to improve the way that performance data is really consumed by city leadership. We started by partnering with the mayor's office and these 50 departments to, I'm going to say just update their strategic goals, but that was a big exercise, is working with them to outline what those were, and if they didn't have these plans already, help them build like a rough version of them, and then just put all of that online so that people can access it. Citizens, other departments can go and see what we're actually trying to do as a city, broken out by department. Then we took these 1,100 metrics and we realigned them with all of the department's goals. You can imagine all the moving pieces of this. I won't go into the details, but we had to make a lot of standard work on our end, a lot of Excel spreadsheets, a lot of merging things together. We ended up removing a quarter of the metrics. So of the 1,100, we cut it down to, it was around like 800, I want to say, a little bit less than that, for a lot of reasons. They were clutter. They didn't fit into the department's strategic goals when we were explicit about it, right? There might be this thing you're counting, like the number of X things that are happening doesn't plug into any of the priorities, so there wasn't really a good use case for it. We just cut it out. Turns out we can make that decision because no one else knew what they were for. They also might have just been put in there for some other reason that wasn't relevant anymore, right? There were other cases where we couldn't validate the data. The program methodology might have been really complex, so the team didn't understand it. Or even if they did, our audience, the city leadership around in departments and the mayor's office and the board of supervisors, sometimes it was just too complex for them to understand what they were looking at, right? They'd see like a 2.3, but have no understanding of what that was. So we worked with managers and departments to identify information that would be more valuable. In some cases, we were able to just add metrics that they were already tracking. That was helpful. But in more cases, it was kind of just a brainstorming activity, right? We have this goal, you have no metrics tied to it because we've never really talked about it in this way before. It helped get eyes onto this work. It helped them talk about things that they really cared about in a format that we were handling that they hadn't really seen as a resource before. And in other cases, it just helped them tell a story or keep track of trends that maybe their staff were aware of, but the department heads weren't really aware of. The most important thing for us, though, was that this really led to deeper conversations with staff and department heads about what they wanted from performance measurement, what they wanted from their partnership with us. And in some of those cases, we were like, yeah, we were just jazzed for it. And in other cases, they basically asked us to be their performance management team. So we had to say no, unfortunately, but they're trying to hire analysts now, which is a good, sort of a good indicator that they care about this. This really revealed and elevated performance data in some of these departments that weren't doing this work already. It emphasized the relationship with their strategic goals, so they knew how it plugged in, and it provided a format to share feedback about how our work was doing, what they cared about, and how we could be a resource for them. So we learned a lot about how departments in San Francisco were using data, or how they're not. That happened quite a few times. We also learned about what they need from us to do the work better. So some departments really lean into this work, right? They were excited. We were helping them make sense of something that felt technical and complex, and we were just trying to distill it down to stuff that would help them. Other departments did not lean into this, and a few were just actively resistant. And that could be for a lot of reasons, right? And we had a debrief at the end of this exercise within our team, within a few of the partners we worked with, to try and understand what was going on here, what that was about. Again, a lot of reasons, but I think fundamentally it's because we're kind of splitting priorities. We're splitting incentives. Our reporting tries to create demand for performance information at the highest levels in the city. It helps focus attention on issues. It helps shed light on some things that the public or department heads may not be aware of. And we provide that information to city leaders and advocates, and their reaction creates incentives and hopefully resources for the city to act. And I think we made real progress here. We got a lot of attention on this internally, but a lot of other things needed to happen to create and sustain change across all of these departments. So for example, when a department did not have a way to use this data to manage a problem, or a strategy to use the attention they were getting all of a sudden to come up with a solution, or come up with a coalition, or come up with some problem solving that might rely on other people, if they weren't able to do that, they reacted like it was a burden or a threat. And I think a lot of you may have experienced like this from what I've heard from y'all just talking outside of these panels. So we realized that we were missing some important pieces to make all of this work, right? We're just reporting stuff. What's happening with that? Turns out not a lot. We looked around at a bunch of research. We found a couple of things that could help us make sense of this. We just chose this one approach. If you're interested in more of this research, I'm happy to pull that out and give that to you. They're just 6 buckets to kind of assess how we were doing. Were we doing these things? Did our strategy include activities here, priorities here? No. So when it comes to clear goals and involved stakeholders, we made progress. We've worked with the mayor's office since this exercise started, and some of our local council members that we call the board of supervisors, to help plan out our content for the next couple of reports and some of our dashboarding that we do every month. Our office also just recently hired its first communications manager, which was a big win for us. Really just someone who thinks about how information is consumed before we produce it has been a big win. And we're working with the other city leaders to figure out how to work this into the budget process. You know, those moments when this information really matters, instead of just, yeah, we got this report, and they look at it and they read it and maybe they're excited, but it doesn't do anything. So we checked off the first two-ish. We're still working on getting stakeholders more involved. In terms of support capacity, we didn't really offer much support, not at the time, but our team does do technical assistance in our other work. We work with departments on special projects or in coaching. So we're trying to identify good candidates through our work to sort of onboard in that TA, right? We just say, we don't have the capacity to deal with this as a program, but we have these other people, these other resources, maybe not even in our office, but other people that we know of who can help you with this. So we're trying to tie those threads together. We also started partnering with our data academy a little bit more explicitly, and that's a training program that our office runs, and it trains analysts and sometimes managers across the city in analytical skills, just hard technical analytical skills. How to build a dashboard in Tableau, how to build a dashboard in Power BI, how to think about metrics and reporting and what that means. And we've become more deliberate about coaching departments when we engage with them. So instead of just asking them for data, we say, give me those metrics that you have. Also, do you have any questions? Can we have a meeting? Can we just go out for coffee and see what's going on here? Mature information system is a problem. When it comes to information systems, a lot of staff and a lot of departments just had trouble getting their own data. Our own platform, and this might sound familiar, is a custom deployment of software that isn't really even used anymore. There's one guy named Howard who manages this for us, and anytime something breaks, he's the guy we go to. We're a little worried about him retiring because everything will stop. But again, we can fix this, right? It's a complex, wonky, technical thing, but a system's a system. We can come up with a solution there. And we are. We're actually about to launch a new platform that's more flexible and easier to use. It's almost out of the box ready. Again, I can talk with you guys more about those options we looked at afterwards. We're also just working with our city's open data team, which runs our open data portal to find ways to automate feeds into the system and reporting out of it to cut out a lot of the work that we were doing and a lot of the headaches that departments were having. The hardest ones of these, culture. That often goes hand in hand with leadership support. We didn't have the tools to tackle this. At least we didn't think we did. We didn't feel like we did. What's culture? It's just kind of an amorphous thing. How do you change a department's culture even when you figure out what you're talking about when you're an outsider? I don't work in the Human Services Agency. I have people there who like me. That helps. But when I show up, to change the way that they're doing work, like those three folks might be excited and everyone else is, who are you, where did you come from? Oh, you're from the controller's office, I'm getting audited. Maybe, probably not. But it's hard, right? We don't really have the tools to deal with this. Fortunately, we've heard a lot of information about this already, right? So Brian's talk this morning was kind of getting at this. Really, when we're talking about culture, it doesn't have to be fuzzy and amorphous. We're talking about habits. We're talking about routines. We're talking about expectations among staff and among management. And those things just turn into norms. They turn into things that are ongoing and expected from each other. And we can kind of affect those things, right? Habits and routines, we can work on those. So we've drawn on lessons from change management and group facilitation. A bunch of our staff got trained on that because we realized there was a gap. And we started using strategies from Lean, which we've heard about a few times already, to coach staff around small improvements that can scale up big changes in the way that they, two big changes in the way that they approach their work. I'm not going to take the wind out of their sails. That's for tomorrow. Go to their presentation tomorrow morning. It's good, and it's work that we're trying to figure out how it aligns with all of this high-level incentive stuff. And it really does. I'm really interested in hearing from you guys about wins that you've had in this space, connecting executive reporting down to like tangible partnerships you have with human beings that actually do the work. But like I said, I really encourage you to go to the presentation, and I'm looking forward to your questions afterwards. Thank you.
All right, I am very excited to be here. I told my fellow panelists that two things. One, I could go on till whatever time we quit tomorrow afternoon on this topic because I really care about it a lot. But also, that's point number one. Point number two is that my audience is people who don't yet believe in the power of data to change organizations. So I should probably like walk out into the street and tell this story instead of telling it to this room, because this room is people who know a lot, care about, and are already on board. So I'm going to try not to talk too long so that we can get to the Q&A. But I want to start with a couple of the things that Brian said this morning stuck out to me. One was about how we always have to connect back to purpose. So I thought I'd share with you my purpose. My purpose in life is to make government better by inspiring more use of data. And so this paper that I wrote that I wanted to talk about today is a paper that makes the case for data analysts, chief data officers, whatever you want to call the name. I just, sometimes people, because I write a lot about chief data officers, and people ask me all the time, does the title matter? And I say, I could care less if you call it Queen of Data, as long as there's someone who's in charge of data. So, this whole talk is about a paper I wrote on making the case for data officers in government. Okay, so I'm going to talk about 5 things. Number one, why I care. I'm going to do an overview of the conceptual model that I developed for documenting ROI. I'll give a few examples, and then I hope, are we sharing out the PowerPoints? Great. So some of my slides are ridiculously hard to read, but when we get to the tools section, there are links to all these really cool tools that you might want to have access to. So don't try to read the screen, just trust me, you'll get the links in the PowerPoint. And then the very last slide has a link to the full paper that I did. Okay, so that's the overview of where we're going. There were 2 things that Brian talked about this morning that I wanted to come back to. One was always stay connected to purpose, which I told you about. And the other was, remember when he said that the thing that we have control over is our attitude? I thought that was so perfect to hear Brian say that this morning, because, why are we here? Because we care about government. And some of us are actually working in government at the moment, and some of us are outside observers and commentators about government. So this morning, when it was still dark out, on my way to the gym, I live in Boston, I live in the city. So I see this guy, and he's emptying a trash barrel into a truck. Now, how many of you really love the smell of walking by when that is happening? All right, so here's a guy whose job, he's in the middle of his workday, and I'm still like a few hours before I get to work, because I'm just going to go to the gym and so on. So his workday starts at dark 30 and involves smelliness, right? But I walk by and I say, thank you for your work. And he turns to me and he says, absolutely, got to keep this street clean, and has this smile that would have lit up this entire room. And I thought, oh my God, I'm so lucky that on a day when I'm coming to be with my fellow good government geeks, that I get to actually have my first personal interaction of the day be outside my door with someone who just brings passion and purpose and commitment. And you know what? Like, he does his work in the dark and it smells. Can you imagine how much easier our jobs are? Most of us, most of the time. Anyway, so that's why we all do what we do. And what I hope to do with this paper that documents the return on investment for analytics is to inspire more mayors and governors and department heads and people who have the dollars and decision-making authority to hire more people like those of you in the room. So that's why we're here. Let's go. So why did I do this? First of all, because there is huge untapped value in applying data in government. According to McKinsey, $1 trillion of value could be achieved by government by using data and analytics. And they note that innovation projects in government are twice as likely to succeed when they have data. So going back to what Brian said this morning, trying to make that quantum leap innovation, we're not as likely to be successful as when we do incremental innovation. But the other thing is that whenever innovation is powered by data, it's more likely to succeed. So I was inspired to do this because I think it's important. The other reason I was inspired to write a paper about return on investment for analytics is that when I looked around for the paper that made this case, I couldn't find it because no one's done it. And partly it's because the people who are busy doing this stuff in government don't have time to write about it. You know, I work with a lot of chief data officers. I help run a group of chief data officers in cities. And I've worked with a bunch of federal chief data officers, having recently written about that topic. And the ones who are really good at doing data analytics are busy. So they don't have time to write their success story. Anyway, so that was one of the reasons I wanted to do this paper. Another is that as I started to poke around and ask, so few people are documenting what they're doing that there's no standard methodology out there. So I'm hoping maybe somebody will read my paper and decide to develop some good methodologies and so on. You know, my hope is to just start the conversation and hope things accelerate from there. So I want to finish with a quote from Linda Gibbs, who used to run Health and Human Services for the City of New York. She looked at why administrative data is not often enough used to do data analytics. And so that quote there, government data is underappreciated, underdeveloped, and underused. My goal is to increase the number of data leaders in government by demonstrating their value. Okay, so what was my research process? I started by talking to people I knew, the 20 or so chief data officers who are part of a civic analytics network that we convene at Harvard twice a year. Next week we'll be with them. So it started a year ago when I was asking around for examples of ROI. And then I have what I call the international convenience sample, which is every time I'm at a conference with, you know, so the Estonia, the UK, all these, you know, highly touted success stories in data and digital government. I keep asking people, and there really aren't very many success examples out there of ROI. So it took me about 6 months to pull from various places. And the bottom line is, this is still early days. There are not a lot of fully documented return on investment for analytics. So I came up with a model. My model is essentially what are the buckets into which we can categorize types of return on investment. So I have 3 categories. Dollars, right? Can you save money by doing it more efficiently, by being more accurate, by rooting out fraud? So can you save money? Or in places where we actually generate revenue, can you generate more by being more efficient? So financial value is the most concrete, easy to measure. Harder to measure is if we're more efficient in our process. We can do more, we can deliver more results to the public, and sometimes we can actually quantify the dollar value of that. And then the third type is the most ishy-squishy, but in some ways the most important, which is faith in government. We all know that public trust in government is at all-time lows. What can we do to increase it? There are, you know, more transparency, more demonstration of results. So these are my 3 categories. At the end of the presentation, there's my contact info. So anyone who has comments, reactions, ways to embellish and improve this, let me know, because this is really the 1.0 version of this conceptual model. So, okay, so this is a slide that you can't possibly read, right? But I have 3 of them. So if I put them all on one slide, it would have been even worse. Anyway, so this is the typology of the financial return, and essentially, I guess I shouldn't walk. So essentially, this shows the first three categories of ways that you can save money, eliminate fraud, waste, and abuse. There's one example in the paper of the state of Texas data coordinator looked at data of people who are incarcerated and people collecting unemployment benefits. And you know what? When you take those two together, should you be collecting unemployment while you're incarcerated? Probably not, right? So $90 million of fraud has been prevented through that. So can you detect fraud? Can you prevent it? And then the second category is efficiency savings. Can we, so almost every government, almost every city government has public buildings. City of Boston saves $1 million a year through energy efficiency just by monitoring and controlling. And it's not that our buildings are too cold in the winter and too hot in the summer. In fact, I still have to carry a sweater into the Boston Public Library branch near me. My library branch saves $40,000 a year in energy costs just by looking for efficiencies. So accuracy improvement. The City and County of San Francisco is an example in my paper where by having the assessor's office be able to be more accurate, using predictive analytics algorithm, be more accurate in knowing which tax assessments they need to audit, or audit may not be the right word, but where they need to make sure that the reported home sale price is the market value rather than, I sold it to my friend for a discount, got $2.8 million in additional revenue. So we also have in Boston, how many of you are from Boston? Great, okay, so if you're familiar, we have the newest area of the city, the Seaport District, kind of sprouted up out of nowhere. I call it mini Dubai because everything's tall and shiny and brand new. But the city has implemented dynamic pricing. So this is a way to be more efficient, that the busiest places you pay more to park, the less busy places you don't pay as much. But that's a way to get more revenue by being more equitable. Okay, so that's financial value. Operational process improvement. Many of you already know very well about how to do lean and other process improvements. But I've come up with two categories, which is efficiency of, kind of, can you do it faster? Can you do it better? But then the second category for me is safety, right? Can you actually be better at detecting hazards? City of Boston actually has a GIS data-informed system where 7 different data feeds come into one dashboard so that a firefighter en route to a fire knows where hazmat reports have come in, knows where there are property and building issues, so that I love it in my city that the data nerds are protecting and making safe the world for firefighters. Isn't that cool? Little kids always think firefighters are heroes, but in this city, data people are heroes too. Anyway, so operational process improvement is my second category. The third category is faith in government. And there are a couple of examples here. One is some friends of mine in the city of Buenos Aires have done an online survey of public trust in government, and they were able to make significant improvements in public faith in government by just showing people on the website information that was already there. And interestingly, they found that 40% of the people they contacted had no idea that there even was such a thing as a government website. So those of you who have the power to do so, let's spread the word about what good there is in open data. Okay, so I have a lot more slides, and I'm probably out of time, but so a couple of financial examples. 3 minutes, okay. So I already talk fast. I'm gonna start talking a little faster. So one key takeaway for me in this process was that very few of the dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of people I talked to actually documented return on investment. The few who do often leave government. The City of Louisville performance manager job has turned over a couple times since they did the analysis that showed they brought back $5 for every $1 invested in the performance team. Cincinnati did the analysis, $8 return for every $1 investment, another person who's left government. San Diego, actually, the person who did this measurement has since left government, but they have smart meters for their streetlights, and they're projected to not only save $2.4 million, but use 60% less energy, which is, good. That's good for the pocketbook and good for the planet. So here we go. Talk about good for the pocketbook and the planet. The city of Boston did a hackathon. Some MIT grad students won, and were able to come up with a smart routing for school buses that saved 5 million and 20,000 pounds of carbon emissions. So, and the Federal Health and Human Services Office of the Inspector General, the chief data officer there she's so amazing. I love her. She says, well, I was a data scientist before we even had the term data scientist. And her office returns $5 for every $1 of cost. She's had, it seems like every year she has $1 billion plus takedown of fraud. One, which was $1 billion takedown of overprescribing of opioids. So there are so many ways in which we can, as taxpayers, be grateful for them for doing that. Process improvement. Why is this important? Why does it matter? Because according to Deloitte, we can save 1.2 billion hours by doing data and technology. The result would be $41 billion of labor cost. Now, that's 2 NASAs, right? Yeah, so this stuff is important. Okay, so the Data Academy that Luke mentioned was last quantified by the now no longer in government chief data officer, who quantified for me that the 1 minute? Okay. Anyway, so they save 1.7 million a year. What's a presentation without a picture of a rat? The city of Chicago has become 20% more efficient in finding those little buggers with a predictive analytics algorithm. They are also 7 days faster to find a kind of thing that would make you sick at a restaurant by doing food inspections with predictive analytics. Syracuse saves $1 million a year, which is big money in a small city, by using predictive analytics to identify the water mains that are going to break, because who wants to get stuck in traffic because of a water main break and then have to boil your water and so on and so forth. So there are lots and lots of ways. That's wonderful. New Orleans is increasing the efficiency and equity of ambulance response, because if my neighborhood is 20% slower than your neighborhood to get an ambulance, I could die. And so they've used mapping and data analytics to be more efficient. Okay, so there we go. The tools, as I mentioned, you can't possibly read that slide, but if you get the PowerPoint, you'll have a link to these wonderful resources that help with cost-benefit analysis and so on and so forth. And I'll just sum up with this, I think, quite hopeful quote from one of the chief data officers. This is, I heard a couple people say they started in Peace Corps. Brandon Pustojavsky, who is the chief data officer at USAID and also was a Peace Corps volunteer, he says about the state of data in federal government: we're listening, we're iterating, we're moving forward. There's still so much left to do, but these are exciting times and the best days are ahead of us. Isn't that great? Anyway, so this is a picture of the paper that I wrote with a link. All those of you who want to print off the executive summary and hand it to someone who can make the decision about hiring more data people, and there are the links. Thank you.
Thanks for my tardiness. I was on an Uber and I got tied up. I'm a Suffolk product. I went here, MPA program 95, so I'm very proud of this institution. My undergrad was the University of Chicago, so that's why I'm somewhat in awe of the Harvard presence on the panel, so that's why I was kind of late. But as we say in Chicago, nothing more practical than a good theory. So anyway, cut to the chase. We were, I've taught a number of years, collaboration being my focus, and I worked with a student in child protection welfare programming out in North Carolina. Next slide. I'm going to go through this quickly. So what we developed was this notion of going back to Herbert Simon in terms of the Proverbs of public administration. Next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. So what we did is, out in North Carolina, there was a kind of a need to, out in North Carolina, they run their child protection services at the county level. So I was informed that there was some challenges in terms of the administration of these programs, in that they had to travel a far distance to get training and so forth. So it was really challenging. Not only that, they frequently didn't go, and folks had to do that in order to engage the service, if you will. So I worked with one of my students, and we ultimately developed this training program. It's called Real Simulation. But anyways, to kind of go back to the academic realm, we were talking about collaboration and why doesn't it work all the time? So what I thought of is, essentially I didn't want to take Larry O'Toole on or Ken Meyer, so I said, let me get somebody big enough that I can stand under their shield of warmth and protection. And I looked at Herbert Simon, a fellow University of Chicago grad, Nobel laureate, great academician. So we looked at why doesn't collaboration work, although the need is pervasive. And so oftentimes, these are some of the key reasons why, hierarchy, folks just don't want to work together, et cetera, et cetera. So what we looked at was Simon's decision-making question. And ultimately, what I looked at was collaboration, I think, should be thought of as a proverb in the field. That said, it looks at, ultimately, are we asking the right questions in terms of the collaboration? And I think the two strands that come to mind is what I term the sans hierarchy, without hierarchy, like-minded folks getting together, and then the hierarchical arrangement. Ultimately, somebody has to say, Mother may I, that's where they get their check paid from. So it's very complex, but ultimately, as per Simon, we didn't ask the right question. Fundamentally, what tool do we have to use? And he argues, in order to do that, it has to be exhaustive. You have to look at every criteria and measure it. And that's what we haven't done in the literature here. So ultimately, if we look at North Carolina's big woodworking state, ultimately, are you going to have a living room or a closet? That's what Simon questioned. So you got to understand what tool you're going to look at. And this is a very good quote. It's on page 43. So ultimately, he argues that a field has to ask all these criteria, and that's what we haven't seen. So anyway, so these are the tools. So you got to actually pick a right tool for the right reason. And I think that's where we're falling behind in the academic literature. So the collaboration, so 10 counties and Western 10, we call them. Western Carolina University is working with us as the hub, and we're building partnerships with the community college. So what we've done is develop this real training simulation as an innovation to funnel in like a spoke in a wheel, a hub system. And we're working with the state of North Carolina as well as the University of Illinois. We've done a lot on real simulation. Basically, this type of training actually takes actors and they simulate different events. So a social worker would go in and, figure out, is there, some type of abuse, alcohol abuse, whatnot. So this pink part is the western part of North Carolina. So if they have to travel all the way to the eastern part, it's very long and very time consuming. So this is why this collaboration kind of emerged. So what we kind of developed over the course of 5 years working on this is the notion of administrative tethering. And this is developed by the Wright, Wright model. I worked with her up at Norwich University. And what we look at is the kind of, typically what happens when these collaborations emerge, a mid-range manager is often knocked on his door or her door and saying, oh, by the way, you have to do this collaboration. And oftentimes this is in addition to the regular work. So what occurs is that they have to be able to straddle both realms, the hierarchy and the innovation. And on one side we have innovation, on the other side we have hierarchy. The hierarchy says controls the spending. Innovators like to spend, and they spend too much. So think of these complex solutions, remedies to these complex problems, if you will. So we developed this thing called administrative tethering as a concept. Moreover, we also emerged the notion of wave interaction. If you ever saw the gravitational wave, what happens is two forces collide, black holes, and they create energy waves. And that's what we would argue is happening in collaboration. There's a variety of energy waves that tend to emerge that permeates in an omnidirectional manner the notion of a collaboration venue. And this is important because right now we can't really think of along the lines of time, vertical, horizontal. We have to think omnidirectional, being that there's the time, distance, and things like that due to the internet and so forth, place us in a different realm in terms of collaboration. So this is the Wright model. You can see venue 1 is your home organization. Venue 2 is the tethering. And venue 3 is the collaboration, the innovation. And we argue that this is a way to begin to think about ways to capture all those criteria that Simon says we need to do in order to understand collaboration as a principle as versus a proverb. And these are some kind of interactions that emerge in terms of the various venues. And this is some other ones. And ultimately, all these kind of things interact with different events, different cycles, et cetera. And then we ultimately looked at that these could be ultimately tools for models that give weights to the measurements as per Simon. And so ultimately, the tethering is important for the manager because the collaboration depends upon it. And this is the tethering realm, and this looks at a balancing between different force vectors that then can allow the collaboration to emerge as salient and thus sustain itself. And we frequently are poised to say, how do you get a collaboration to sustain itself? And everybody can't get past that because they don't balance it the right way in terms of these venues, what we argue. And so you can kind of see the push and the pull here. And then the tethering kind of balances it out. It acts as an equalizer, if you will, and that's the work of today's manager, and that's what he or she's up against, if you will, at all levels. So this looks at a power vortex in terms of a dysfunction. So if there's no tethering, typically what happens is one side gets heavy, or it kind of coalesces to the needs of the hierarchy versus the innovation. Consequently, the collaboration collapses. So benefits realized for our approach here, robust collaboration. We've gotten 1,000 members through the work, through this innovative work training program. It's been sustained for 2.3 years without money, other than the county spending in helping out with the innovation. We're poised to get some things from the state, et cetera. County pooling local resources for the project, greater mobility for grant procurement, because now we're all rowing in the same direction. We're actually going to have a summit October 1st, et cetera. So this is going to bring the whole Western 10 together for a real collaboration. See how we're doing and so forth. And then local voice and influence. So it's kind of like a lobbying. All these entities coming together is a powerful political force and administrative force. So I mentioned the notion of the wave. So what happened was when we were looking at this, Kevin and I, Kevin the practitioner, me the academician, holed up in a living room, him out in the field dealing with the slings and arrows. I've been in the practice myself, but I know where he sits. So we thought of this notion of wave administration. In a sense, it's beyond collaboration. It's another perspective to consider, that if you ever, again, see the gravitational wave literature or, go on TED Talks, you'll see really good presentations of it. So this looks at the application of propositions that we develop in order to manage the wave, which is a force that, if not properly managed, tends to disrupt collaboration or sustain it in a very powerful way. So the concept of wave management, through tethering, we look at how the manager can react and manage and deal and precurse the challenges that, for example, like in a post-innovation environment, we frequently see organizations kind of imploding in the sense of, or as it relates to the collaboration, because they tend to get a different viewpoint of, hey, we got the innovation done, what's next? What's in it for me? Where do we go from here? And that tends to create a lot of anxiety and tension and so forth. And actually, when we implemented this, we got a lot of good news coverage. There was a lot of pushback in terms of, what are the next steps? So that's where we developed these propositions. And ultimately, we're actually linking to this notion of flock management. So we got a few things going on here. And this is kind of a faith-based notion of flock management to work with the members of the collaboration. So propositions, these are some propositions for the management. So I'm not going to read them all, but basically we developed 10 of them that we ultimately are going to put into a think piece, if you will. The first one, talking about collaboration as a proverb as opposed to a principle. And then secondly, and moreover, suggesting a different theoretical approach to collaboration. And then ultimately talk about wave administration as being our think piece 2, TP2. And these show all the things that are necessary in order to do and manage in an administrative fashion. And ultimately, we identified a process here because what has occurred over the last 5 years is that these Western 10 have started out from point A to point B, et cetera, and now it's evolved to another kind of entity, if you will, and I mean that in a good way, that all these various sub-departments are now working together, but also now we're seeing that they have to be managed at a micro level. So we've actually, in order to deal with this, we developed a wave room. We call it the W10 wave room as opposed to a war room, in which we manage the influx of all these ins and outs of, not only the personalities, but the administrative management side, so we can actually drive this through the process. And ultimately, flock management, we're working with folks from Liberty University and other theological entities to bring together those notions, because what we found was a lot of correspondence between some of the faith-based work being done as well as administration. I'm getting the hook sign now, so I got to finish up here. So anyway, so these propositions provide analytical lens for decision-making and collaboration. In summary, we look at collaboration. We look at the public manager who struggles to sustain meaningful collaboration. Tethering is a notion that builds upon the Wright model, and flock management, as driven by wave administration, is a different perspective in order to see the broader perspective of public administration as a field of service and ultimately management, as Herbert Simon taught us. Thank you very much, and I appreciate your time and attention.
Okay, so let's take a few minutes for questions at this point. Do we have questions for the panel? I'll pose a question then. In terms of what you've been talking about, there's some thread of capacity building going through this. And I think that capacity building is often neglected when we're measuring. So what can we do to measure capacity for performance improvement rather than just an emphasis on outputs, outcomes, feedback, whatever? So, anyone? Yes, Luke.
That's a great question that I think we struggle with a lot in our work, especially through the Data Academy, which I mentioned and you mentioned as well, is kind of the big piece in our office that focuses on explicit, deliberate capacity building. But it's hard. I mean, as you said, the people doing the work are busy, and we're often just thinking of like, we're not just training someone to build their capacity. We're typically training someone because we want them to adopt a specific skill for a particular reason. Often the people that I've worked with and trained through the Data Academy, I'm teaching them Tableau, for example. We're not just teaching them Tableau to build their capacity. We're teaching them Tableau because we want them to build a dashboard to report specific information because someone asked for it. So I think it kind of ends up with like not a very satisfying answer, at least on my part. We generally just measure it as like the number of people trained, the number of sort of things that they've created. But I don't think we really have a solid framework yet for how we think about it just administratively.
Jane?
So I just want to add to that, which is that the Data Academy has been copied by so many other cities. And one of the replicator cities, the chief data officer said to me that it's the most important thing he does because it breaks down silos. And that's an interesting thing. You know, Mark, your question was really, how are we measuring the outcome? And that's one that's hard to measure. That, oh, because I was sitting next to so-and-so, I got to learn about their agency, or I got to have a person I can bounce ideas off of in another place. And the power of getting outside of our own boxes is something that is very hard to measure, but is so important in government.
I would add one more quick thing onto that. We've actually started in some of the classes we teach, starting the whole session off by just having people talk about why they're there with each other. We just step back for 5 minutes and let them talk, and it turns out that that's really powerful because we end up hearing about these collaborations and partnerships that have sprung up and that we're not even part of. And I think that's where it gets hard to measure, but that's definitely a metric of success for us.
I think, Mark, you were talking about capacity. How do you measure capacity and capacity building? That's a tough question. You can look at knowledge, skills, and abilities, okay, and you can measure knowledge, skills, and abilities of individuals at different levels. But if you're looking at capacity, is it their capacity to do more with less? Is it their capacity to be more efficient as a manager than they were before? You have to look at some of the variables that you're trying to measure and go from there. You've been in this business a long time. That's not an easy thing to do.
Well, I mean, one of the things I was thinking about was the capacity to innovate. What do we do to really teach people how to look for innovations, which I think is very often skipped over completely, and so that when they do measure the outputs and the outcomes, they're not injecting new knowledge into the problem-solving process. So if your indicators show you that there's a problem or a shortfall or underutilized, services, whatever, how do you find out? How do you inject models from across the country, from around the world, where they've, very creatively approached these problems? So I think that's a blind spot that we have, for example, and I think that could be measured in the sense of, could we teach them to look for these models?
Yep.
Could we, teach them to find the models? For example, it's just one example. Yes, question here.
So I'm curious, with Data Academy, have you found...
Just a little louder, just...
Sorry. With Data Academy, have you found... have you found that Data Academy trickles up? In other words, there's no doubt that in a department, leadership will see the value of the data, and you mentioned that then people come together and collaborate or recognize their similarities and how they can work together. Have you found that then that works its way up such that leadership recognizes that these departments can work together, and what are the obstacles that they face in acting on some of the outcomes that you've identified?
I can speak to the anecdote of it. I'm not sure if you would have more of the research side of this, but ish. Yeah, I mean, often no, frankly. The managers who are overseeing the analysts or the staff that we work with are often happy that their staff can do this new thing, but that doesn't necessarily translate into more proficiency for them. Maybe more awareness, and I think that there's probably an unfounded expectation, maybe, that if their staff are talking more about data and using more data, that they'll just become more aware of it. And we've seen that sometimes, but it kind of takes a critical mass of people in that team to be comfortable using those things and building tools and applying it to their work for the manager to really become more literate in those things. There are cases where we've brought managers into the Data Academy because we think that like the team would benefit from that. And I think in that direct training, that direct application, there are likely benefits. But no, I think it's a shaky assumption to think that because we train 3 or 4 people in a team of 10, that the manager will get better at that work. Often they just don't.
And I'll just say a word about the cities in the U.S. that have replicated the San Francisco Data Academy or adopted and adapted it. Your question is awesome because the answer is 0. The big hole is really at the leadership level in getting data and digital literacy. And I wrote a whole blog post about it. So if you give me your card, I'll share it.
Sure.
Hi, I was really intrigued by your 3 types of ROI, that model. One of the things that I deal with in my organization is a fear that if we identify savings, that money will be taken from us. So there's a mindset that, if we save, $40,000, say that our budget will be cut by $40,000. So this creates almost like a negative feedback loop where, even when there are opportunities to save money, we still feel that we have to spend, whatever we're given and keep spending that amount, or we're going to have more taken from us. So any thoughts on that, how to address that and to make it not an obstacle to being able to demonstrate savings? Because a lot of people want to demonstrate that, but then there's that underlying fear that that's going to have a negative implication because of the way they're incentivized.
So there's a great book called The Price of Government by David Osborne, and in it there's a whole section on what he calls gain sharing, which is where you actually set up in advance that if we find savings, this department, get to keep some of it. And you figure out what the right sum is so that there is an incentive. Because you're right, if I find $1 and all of it goes to the general fund, no fun for me.
Last question.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mark. I'm going to kind of follow up on your question and then something I asked this afternoon. So, return on investment, ROI. So, my question is, we use performance measures and we have to use budgeting. This is going to tie back to you. The federal government spends billions of dollars a year in grants, not including states, not including foundations. Why can't the federal government, states, or many of the foundations do it, demonstrate a return on investment on what the on federal grants and state grants? I don't think we do a good job. So I'm wondering if any of you have some insights into that, and if there's anyone here who's from a foundation, I'd like to hear that too. Thank you, Mark.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a great question because the data and evidence, I'm not going to get the full title of the act right. Do you remember the exact title of the act? Anyway.
Evidence building, foundations of evidence building something.
Yeah, that
2018.
that act.
It passed during the shutdown, so I don't remember it. I was home. But.
So this federal legislation is going to move a little bit in that direction, but not enough, right? Because one of the things, I was lucky enough to participate in a panel giving comments on the initial action plan for implementing that act that I can't get the full name of. And one of the things I recommended is you got to create like the TurboTax of grant reporting. Make it easy and make it standardized, because otherwise you have all these different grant programs that have different requirements and you can't roll them all up and it's a mess. So I love your question, and I hope the federal government will listen. But I advocate for that.
Any other responses? Okay. So in terms of data, we're going to try to stay on time. Yeah. Just two announcements. One is there are some cards on a table in the back, which are, simulation, but a little, basically, performance manual, sort of exercise we're going to do tomorrow. So please pick those up before you leave today and take a look at them, later on if you can, and see what suggestions you might have for additional, elements of that. That's the objective of the simulation we're doing. And the second is that, just to earlier reminder, we have a networking reception at 4:30 upstairs, 5th floor, Blue Sky Lounge with appetizers and beverages. You just take the elevators up and make a left off the elevator. Okay? All right, so I want to thank the panel. And please help. And now we'll proceed to the collaborating, collaborating to enhance performance, a conversation that should be chaired by Professor Prajabhati Trivedi. So we'll transition.